Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to a new episode of Great Minds on Learning. In this highly acclaimed series, Professor Donald Clark, internationally famous author, blogger and entrepreneur, joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of thought and theorising about learning from the Greeks to the geeks. This episode covers a group of 20th century thinkers and educationalists in both northern and southern hemispheres who developed a variety of alternative visions for schools. Inspired by Enlightenment figures like Rousseau and the German Idealists who came after them, they nevertheless reacted against the strict and regimented so-called Prussian system of education that had become the mainstream. They incorporated ideas from the burgeoning field of psychology and also, in the case of Rudolph Steiner, a strong element of mysticism.
So welcome everybody to this episode of Great Minds on Learning. I'm here with my co-host Donald Clark as usual. This time we're doing schools. In particular, we want to focus on 20th century theorists whose ideas and practice varied significantly from the mainstream when it came to school education. So what was that mainstream, I hear you ask, and where did it come from? Well, as we discovered in episode 26, a very great deal of what we now take as normative in education systems around the world emanated from the writings of German idealist philosophers. That's Kant, Hegel, but especially Herbart and von Humboldt. There's a Herbartian system and a Humboldtian system. Altogether, this is what we call the Prussian system of education. And we know it well, all of us, even if we don't recognize that particular term. It gave us teacher training, set lesson times controlled by a bell, standardized curricula or curriculums, and regular school inspections. The Prussians invented Ofsted. Thank you very much. That was the mainstream. Roughly speaking, that's what our theorists were reacting against. And also in this regard, it's worth mentioning the Arnolds, particularly Thomas Arnold, headmaster of Rugby School from 1828 to 1841, and his son Matthew Arnold. Now, this might seem a bit parochial, as they're Brits, but in fact, the Arnolds had a worldwide effect, especially Thomas Arnold. Thomas Arnold reformed the public schools in Great Britain with innovations like prefects and the house system. During the 18th century, public schools were notorious for riots, town versus gown face-offs, pitched battles between masters and pupils, I'm not kidding, and all sorts of abuse of the children and the community in general. It was a very good episode, a couple of episodes in another podcast, The Rest is History, about these, and they were really worth listening to. Arnold's reforms redefined standards of masculinity and achievement and gave us the muscular, stiff upper lip, battles won on the playing fields of Eton model we recognise from works such as Tom Brown's School Days, Billy Bunter, Mallory Towers by Enid Blyton Jennings, and right down to the Harry Potter stories, which are basically in a final tradition of boarding school stories. Arnold set the mould not only for public schools and grammar schools, in which ate the public schools. I went to one and we had a house system and prefects. I wasn't one in the UK, but it also set the mold for elite schools all over the world and some less elite schools as well. So the son, Matthew Arnold, didn't stand a chance, also made significant contributions, firstly as a schools inspector, travelling the length and breadth of the country as one of the first railway generation, something no other intellectual of his class had been able to do previously. An experience that no doubt fed into his importance as a cultural critic. Culture was his thing, and his seminal work, Culture and Anarchy, sets it at the centre of his vision, in which he saw both individuals, in terms of schooling, and the country as a whole, striving towards human perfection. That sounds very kind of like Hegel.
Yep.
By studying the great minds and texts of the past. Studying the great minds, of course, is just what we're doing here, Donald. It's worth mentioning that Matthew Arnold was also a famous poet. At the start of episode 15, we featured his much-quoted poem, Dover Beach, to show the mood of late Victorian pessimism that afflicted people like Arnold, faced with a coastline full of fossils that spoke of a godless, Bible-contradicting universe ushered in by Darwin. It's a bit of a cliche to cite that, but I think in this context, it's really significant when we come to talk about Steiner and his mysticism. So hold that thought. So, Donald, having given our listeners a flavour of what the mainstream in education looked like, can you now give us the alternative? Introduce us, please, to the merry band of iconoclasts you have assembled, the rebels who wanted to kick over the traces and give us a new vision for schools.
Yeah, as you were speaking there, John, I was trying to think of an analogy for what we're about to do in this podcast. And it's a bit like looking at people with brain damage to try and establish how the brain actually works. Some of these oddball offshoots from the mainstream system. And in many ways, what you summed up there was the bizarre offshoot in, of course, the UK system, which is the private school system, rather bizarrely called the public school system. A rather interesting reversal of meaning. But of course, what has happened is you still get this relentless push from those schools into general state schooling, even though it's only 7% of the schooling system. I didn't actually have to suffer the ridiculous idea of being in a house or whatever. Nevertheless, it has massively influenced the British system. Interestingly, I think you made an interesting point there about how it dominates children's literature. I actually was completely bamboozled by things like the famous five, and can't remember what half of them were now, didn't read them, didn't like them, because it was just like another planet to me. I didn't grow up in that environment. It seemed like very odd. They all had a little dog and went on jolly adventures. And I still actually don't like Harry Potter. I just think it's part of the same genre. I find it hideous, sort of crappy public school magic jokey stuff. So on that controversial note, what I would like to say though is that it's about schooling and schools here. And we went back to the German Idealists and the Prussian model, and Rudolph Steiner was a great fan of people like Schelling and Fichte and so on, Hegel. So that's the origins of that. But of course, schooling goes back to really Mesopotamia. And what's interesting about the origins of schooling is how intimate it is with the invention of writing. So you get writing is invented for the first time in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and both go full-time into schooling for the elite, for what they called scribes. So the Sumerians were first. This is about 3,200 BC. Writing suddenly appears. And we also get the teaching of scribes. So you find these cuneiform tablets baked in fires, preserved for us, that are actually like school books, people practicing their writing, teachers correcting the mistakes of pupils. And the same is true in ancient Egypt. I'll be there in just at the beginning of December this year. I've been to Egypt many, many times. And the culture of writing there, you can't go 10 yards in Egypt without seeing hieroglyphics on stone somewhere. Of course, it becomes captured. Writing is something given by God. The act of writing becomes a fossilization of an idea. It preserves you into the afterlife and so on. So writing is at the heart of schooling. And the same is true of ancient China with the Confucian things, the teaching of the five classics there. So I think that's important. You can follow through with that into ancient Greece. Of course, we have the alphabet, a beautifully concise and workable cursive alphabet, which allows the Greeks to go into writing big time, that whole philosophical tradition. But they have their gymnasiums and academies. But they also have this oral tradition, the sort of Socratic sophists who wander around and teach people. Well, the truth of the matter is, in terms of schooling, it was still mothers who taught their kids at home. People forget this, that for most of our what we call history, people were taught at home or in the context of their job or as apprentices and so on. Rome, of course, copied the Greeks, taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, very writing-based. And even the madrasas into Baghdad, places like the Holy House of Wisdom in Baghdad, massively focused on writing and calligraphy, the book, or the recitation of the Quran itself. And we have all that monastic stuff, Bologna, the university system, I suppose. But the big one, in terms of the origin of schooling, of course, is the Reformation. Because suddenly you have, in Scotland, where I come from, you had almost universal literacy on the back of the Reformation. Every little parish had a school. Writing was taught. But it was taught so that you could read the Bible and scripture and other holy texts. So religion has always been, we've covered this in previous podcasts, a sort of wellspring for schooling as well. And then the Reformation brings printing and the first textbooks, of course, Comenius and others. And then another big one that people often forget is just the industrialization of this. So industrialization leads to the requirement for an educated workforce, of course, and that leads to compulsory education laws and almost universally in Western countries. but that's a direct result of the Industrial Revolution. And in a sense, we're sort of stuck in that mode, I feel. And what's interesting about this group that we're looking at, John, is that these are attempts of people to prick the bubble and jump outside that model because it does seem odd. I mean, anyone who sends their kids to school goes through that. You know, you send them off at 5. It's all very fraught. You know, teachers seem to have an unhappy time. They're always sort of a bit, you know, discontented with their lot. The pupils themselves find it a bit of a labour, especially examination systems. Parents are bamboozled and find it, you know, all too much at times. Politicians are constantly fiddling with it to try and get the system to work. So it's all very fraught. But what we've got are some interesting people here on Steiner, Montessori, and then I've put in some interesting people, I think, who are not Northern Hemisphere. And I think that's important because we often think that schooling is wholly and utterly based on our model, when, of course, for most of the people in the world, and going to Africa a lot, it tends not to be for poor people. it tends to be a very different kettle of fish. So we'll tackle a couple of those from South America as well.
Okay. And we're going to start with Rudolph Steiner. Yeah.
Yes. And then he truly is one of the oddballs. I mean, but yeah, give me your thoughts on Rudolph.
Hey, let's get going.
Yeah.
Rudolph Steiner, 1861 to 1925, was born in a rural village in Hungary, in what's today Croatia. Of course, all those places have moved around in terms of nationality. So he was originally born under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like a lot of people we've mentioned here. His parents were domestic servants. His father was a gamekeeper, I think, who married against the will of their boss, Count Hoyos, who was an aristo. So they had to run away. Rudolph's father became a telegraph operator on the railway, then a station master, upwardly mobile, and mobile in lots of senses. The family moved around a lot. Briefly homeschooled, Rudolph eventually went to the Technische Hochschule in Vienna, which sounds to me a bit like a polytechnic, where he studied mathematics, chemistry, physics, and philosophy. So, you know, an FE establishment by the sound of it. I may be wrong there. His life then took a quite amazing turn when he bagged the job of natural science editor on a new edition of Goethe's work. It's a very prestigious sort of post in publishing, but perhaps not so surprising if you consider that before he even got to the Polytechnic, as I'll call it, he'd already studied Kant, Fichte, and Schelling. So a very bright kid. He then took a job after that at the Goethe archives in Weimar, and wrote 2 books on Goethe. Goethe is very important in his thought before getting his PhD from the University of Rostock. So far, so standard, perhaps, for one of our great minds, but Steiner is a wild card, and the thing that makes him a wild card is esoteric supernatural beliefs and practices. He was an occultist. I mean, this is something I was quite interested when I was young. So when I went to a writer's retreat a while ago, I'd been there a couple of days, and someone said, "Oh, of course, you know, this was the Steiner Center at one point." And I said, "Yeah, I know. I can tell you by the shape of the door frames, by the by what's in the library." And the library was just full of kind of Ouspensky and Gurdjieff and all these people, and you know, Theosophy and so on. So this led him, this interest in the occult, to develop anthroposophy, a spiritual philosophy that bridges the material and metaphysical worlds and infuses all his thought. And I mean, that's all of it. Steiner made significant contributions to fields as diverse as architecture, leading to the organic movement in architecture. And that's why I say I could tell by the shape of the doors that it was a Steiner place. He has a similar effect on the typology. You know, he's got ideas about everything, and it influences everything in the Steiner, what I'm going to call it, a brand. He had ideas about agriculture, biodynamic farming. I spent a holiday on a biodynamic farm, and people were telling me, well, basically it's all woo. It's astrological. You have to plant according to the zodiac and the phases of the moon and so on. Nevertheless, was important in the development of organic agriculture. Medicine, philosophical medicine. People complain to this day that Steiner parents tend to be anti-vaxxers. Thank you, Rudolph. However, it's in the realm of education where Steiner's legacy is most widely recognized. He founded the Waldorf education system based on his holistic development model that emphasizes intellectual, artistic, and practical engagement, resonating with the child's evolving needs. This approach started with the first Waldorf school in Stuttgart in 1919 and has since blossomed into a worldwide movement with over 1,000 schools. Steiner's multifaceted contributions challenge conventional boundaries, urging an integrative view of science, art, spirituality, and practical wisdom. Donald, I'm coming at this, as you can tell already, from a very anecdotal and personal angle, I'm afraid. I've known a number of people who are the products of Steiner education. There's loads of it in Sussex where we live. There's a Steiner school in Brighton, one in East Grinstead that a girlfriend of mine attended, and her mother was a teacher at the school. And they were very prevalent in my friendship group in the 70s and 80s and later in the extended family. Over the years, I've heard all of those kids complaining about having to do eurythmy, how embarrassing it was, giggling about the copper rods, which in ways I can't understand was an important part of eurythmy. And some of the stories I heard about Steiner education, I have to say, I found frankly astonishing. So this is a great chance for me to understand better from the front end, if you like, what it's all about. So fill us in, please.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing that. I've known no one who went to a Steiner school, and my route into Steiner was completely different because I was doing postgraduate work in German philosophy and so on. And I have his book. In fact, I still have his book. This is on Friedrich Nietzsche. So I really came to Steiner, and at the time I thought the book is terrible. By the way, sees Nietzsche as a psychopathological case. It's really a case study. It's not about Nietzsche at all or his ideas. But I mean, it really is. I mean, you can't really underestimate what a wacko he really is. I mean, he has this sort of Platonic idea of the soul that gets resurrected, but then it tips into racism a bit because he thinks there are 7 races, with our current race being the 5th out of 7 historically. But he very much thought that the African race, for example, was very different from everybody else and so on. So there was a bit of sort of German racism in there as well. But all that astral body belief stuff, that we have an astral body and then another separate etheric body and then an I and an ego and so on, a lot of that comes out of the sort of psychoanalytic movement as well, a lot of sort of baloney in that one. But his science was terrible. He believed the heart was actually an emotional organ, that it somehow, it was actually a sense organ for perceiving the outside world. And then he had these weird views about Atlantis and Lemuria, these old civilizations. You see this all the time. I go to Egypt, as I said, in December. And the internet is full of this stuff about how basically astronauts built all these monuments and the Egyptians just came along and wrote upon them, which is complete baloney, of course.
Daniken stuff.
Yeah, so you get all that anti-vax, anti-science type stuff. And you were right about the building. The only thing I know about the building was the famous centre in Switzerland. I cannot remember where it is, but it was the Gotheneum, which is a very famous Steiner building, which he designed because he saw himself as an architect, made entirely out of wood without using any nails, burnt to the ground in 1920 something or other. So we
made it in concrete.
Yeah. But another interesting thing, just to round off on the weirdness, was people often say, "Oh yeah, eurythmics," thinking it's like the Annie Lennox, Dave Stewart thing. But of course, the eurythmics that they use has nothing to do with Steiner. It was actually a method for teaching music. She was quite surprised when she heard that it was related to Steiner. In fact, it was actually something completely separate, although related to dance and music as well. But I do feel sorry for many of the kids that had to go through it, obviously. But so there was all that baloney. But let's put the baloney to one side and see if there's anything in this, because the anthroposophy stuff is a bit weird, all sort of, a bit esoteric as well. But to be honest, I think he's following in a tradition here, which is not German. That's sort of Rousseauian tradition. It's like a systematic version of Rousseau, because or even and with a bit of Piaget thrown in, because he did think there were these distinct stages of cognitive development, like Piaget and many others since. And Vygotsky thought this was true as well. It came through language. It turns out it's much more complicated than any of those people thought, and much more fluid. But he had the view that up to 7, don't bother with school at all. There is something in this, to be honest, because you may as well not start teaching them mathematics at age 4 and 5, because they'll pick it up just as easily, and in fact much easier when they're 7 and mentally capable of doing so. In fact, the danger is you turn them off. So there wasn't schooling for Steiner didn't really start to 7, and that's been widely adopted on the continent in Scandinavia, but obviously not in the Anglo-Saxon world or America and the UK. Then there was these 2 stages, 7 to 14, and then you're sort of 14 to 21. And now he based them on this really weird astral, ethereal things, which is complete nonsense. But there was something in this. But he also thought it was linked to this notion that everybody has a soul, and that soul had this weird memory in it. But then it's like one of these recipes. He just plucks things out of history and throws them into the mix, because he also used the medieval 4-way distinction, that chlorette, sanguine, melancholic, phlegmatic thing. He throws that into the mix as well. So whenever you read stuff, it's an absolute shambles, as it were. But beneath it, there's something quite interesting here. And of course, it's one of those systems that a lot of progressive people who don't want their kids to go through mainstream schooling would like to choose, because they see it as being more relaxed and more open. It turns out not to be that, actually. Whilst it's a sort of non-selective, boys and girls together, it's certainly not single sex. The teachers are really given masses of headroom to do what they want. There's still it's an alternative to what we all recognize as the ridiculously oppressive nature of schooling in the state and public school systems. And therefore, I fully understand why people choose this. But I think when you dig into the system itself, then the sort of weird racism, the oddball, slightly anti-science, if not anti-science, alternative science stuff actually clashes massively with what most people would want for their kids, which is a dose of realism and rationalism at school, so that they don't fly off at odd angles. It almost has it's almost like a religious school with a made-up religion. But is there anything that's worth salvaging in it? I'm not too sure there is. And we started with Steiner, but I think he's probably the one that is more off the wall than others who were, I think, more rational in their approach in terms of methodology and educational goals. But I don't know, what was your experience, John, of the people who went there? Do you think, how did it influence them? What do you feel about the after effects of it all?
But it's really interesting. So I've thought a lot about it, and obviously a lot of my life has been spent in the creative industries, and you do tend to find a lot of kind of ex-Steiner alumni there. They function very well in those contexts, because there is so much emphasis on creativity in the Steiner education. But how much of that is actually selection? Obviously, it's kind of private schooling. It's very middle class, centered around places like East Grinstead, which, it's slightly culty. The kids I knew, their parents had been alternative in an earlier generation. And of course, the kids would, this was the punk era, the kids would complain about how there was such a big hippie thing involved in it. And actually the hippies really took to all that kind of alternative medicine, distrust of science, what are you rebelling against? What have you got? And a lot of Steiner stuff really chimed with that. And to go back a bit further, and his roots in the sort of end of the 19th century, mysticism, occultism, Annie Besant, theosophy, Aleister Crowley, who has a house near us in Plumpton, that was bought by Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin. Those two eras, there's a big kind of confluence of interests and beliefs, really. So Steiner was ideally placed, Steiner schools were ideally placed in the 60s for people like Peter Cook, for instance, the English satirist who set up Private Eye. He sent his kids there. You would come across a lot of the kids had famous parents. I mean, obviously this was going to help them in life anyway, But you did see a lot in the creative industries. You saw a lot of kind of ex-Steiner people. One thing I felt at the time, and this might be in the context of today, might sound a bit wrong, but I felt that it was very good for women, but the boys seemed a bit lost. The women who'd come through Steiner education just seemed to have a kind of wider sense of possibilities, and I can do this, because they had not been stopped, in the course of their education. They hadn't been kind of sent off to go and sew and do stuff like that. The boys felt a bit adrift because they didn't have that, harsh upbringing as was in the state system had, of the peer group hierarchy, intense kind of bullying, which is so much part of the culture of schools, actually. And they just didn't, a lot of them, to me, just didn't seem to know how to function and fit into the world. Whereas the women seem to have a better time of it, and, were very kind of strong, self-directed, all the rest of it. But that's a very subjective opinion. Just one more thing I thought I'd say about it. When you look at the 30s and 20s and 30s, when he was writing his stuff, he doesn't align with any of the major currents of thought, really. Although, as you say, he's got this kind of background in the German Idealists. If you really look at his stuff, it's not a Marxist, it's not a fascist, and these were the major bits of thought. In that age, really, his thought is orthogonal, I think is the word, to everything else that's going on, which is, I think, what in a way, odd way preserved it and made it so popular in the 60s, when it became part of the alternative counterculture, if you like. And one last note on the racism. When you look at that, it's interesting. It comes out of his theories of reincarnation.
That's right. Yeah.
He felt that as we were moving through this, development, which sounds like very eugenic among the races that were hierarchized, it was the fact that with reincarnation, they were gradually progressing towards being more white. It's loathsome, but like everything else in his philosophy, it's eccentric and yet oddly systematic. Steiner had an answer for everything. Steiner's always right. It's a total explanation system like Marx, but it is, as you say, at its root, a bit woo.
Yeah, it's a good description, that orthogonal, because it was a reaction to the German idealism we discussed in another podcast in some detail. It was a reaction to that, but still very German. In that, he felt he had to come up with his own form of idealism, which is really a sort of Platonic idea of resurrection in the soul, quasi-religious ideas, essentially. And very much an individual thinker, but that's his problem. His problem is nothing universalizes. He doesn't have enough to form a really reasonable theory of education. He's not that interested in how people learn in that sense. He's very much about imposing his rather bizarre ideas on other people. And of course, that's very German, but the next person we're going to... that distinction between men and women is very interesting. Women may have been able to thrive better. They had more autonomy and earlier maturity than boys in schooling, which we find in our current schooling system. But then we've got our second person here, who is one of the few women who really are superbly well known and massively influential in the area of learning theory, and that's Montessori. And she in many ways there are similarities, but vast differences as well.
So let's move on to her. Maria Montessori, 1870 to 1952, was born in a place which I'm now going to struggle to pronounce, I'm afraid. Chiaravalle, Italy, to a military officer and a relative of the Italian geologist and paleontologist Antonio Stoppani. So, that was her background. It's very academic in a way. Her educational journey was marked by a relentless pursuit of knowledge, leading her to the University of Rome's medical program, where she broke gender barriers to become one of the first female physicians in Italy. She also faced a lot of really regrettable prejudice and blatant sexism along the way through her career. And it's quite sad reading about all that. Her foray into educational theory came through her work with children with intellectual disabilities. Montessori's observations and studies laid the groundwork for what would become the Montessori method, a child-centered educational approach that emphasizes self-directed activity, hands-on learning, and collaborative play. The first I mean, that can sound a bit like Waldorf schools, but actually it's much more hard-headed in Montessori and
That's right.
less of the woo. The first Casa dei Bambini, or Children's House, was opened in Rome in 1907, providing an environment where children could explore their interests and develop their potential at their own pace. Personalized learning, as we'd say now. Montessori's innovative method revolutionized early childhood education, highlighting the importance of fostering independence, observation, and a love of learning. Today, her legacy lives on with over 20,000 Montessori schools operating worldwide, so a lot more than the Steiner establishments. My son actually worked in one for a brief period, but that's my only autobiographical anecdote here. Donald, can you unpack her contributions for us and the lasting impact of her progressive ideas on alternative education?
Yeah, that's right. I think you summarised that very, very well there. It's much more structured than the Steiner thing, but with, as you said, less of the woo. But still, there's, like Steiner in a sense, there was this focus on the social and emotional development of the child as opposed to just the rational and intellectual side. That was terribly important for her. It has this global reach, you know, hugely successful. Even 20,000 schools sounds like a lot, but in the big picture of things, probably, you know, not a big deal in a sense. So there was the emotional and well-being side of things, which is important now, and rightly so, I think. There's also the big thing for me was this independent and self-directed learning. The idea that this is what you have to foster in children. You have to foster that sense of independence. And interestingly, I have a Montessori school just around the corner from me and got to know the people through that and the methods. I've been in the school, so on. And I often see the Montessori kids being taken out in the morning. They're much more freewheeling about getting the kids out of the school as opposed to locking them up in rooms all day. But a thing that really struck me as interesting, because I've been involved in technology all my adult life, was this, you know, some really well-known people who went there, including Larry Page and Sergey Brin of Google, who both actually attribute their drive and self-directed attitude to life to their Montessori education very directly. They often say this. Also, Amazon's Jeff Bezos. Now, I also mistakenly put down Jimmy Wales because I read that somewhere. And amazingly, Jimmy Wales got back to me on Twitter saying, no, I didn't go to a Montessori school. He did go to a little schoolhouse. It was almost like Montessori, but, you know, it was like only a couple of pupils and so on. But nevertheless, I think there's some very, very famous people who have emerged from this system. But your question was, you know, what is it really? What, you know, you went through the Casa del Bambini stuff and the early development of this. But I think what she's perhaps most known for is the Montessori method. Okay. Now here, she absolutely is in the, not in the German idealist tradition, but in the Rousseau tradition. Okay. She did have this view, like Neill, who we're going to be discussing as well, that you have to let children develop naturally. And that means giving them agency, personal independence. And that's just like A.S. Neill, who will come to in a minute. She thought that actually children were thwarted by the constraints of contemporary educational systems, the sitting them down, the bells, the moving them from one class to another, the strict and almost unconnected curriculum, the lack of relevance the kids see of what they're learning. And she thought that was in direct, you know, that conflicted with the child's natural tendency. We'll use the word tendency in Italian, to behave or learn. So that notion of giving the children agency lies at the whole root of the method. And that's why, but to be fair to Montessori, well, she didn't leave it at that. She actually then built schools, built classrooms, and built all these tools that will allow children to learn with this sense of agency. So the classrooms are really, I don't know if you've ever been in a Montessori classroom, they're so different from other classrooms, you know, there's no assigned seats, you can sit anywhere, there's lots of these really weird low tables and mats, you know, the whole thing is designed for the children, as it were. And then you have this, it's all sort of mapped out in terms of areas where they do different subjects. You know, it's quite highly sort of highly organized in a phase. You think it's disorganized, but actually it's massively organized. Often natural materials, wood, they're less on the artificial type stuff, very low shelves for books and stuff. And all the kids beautifully tidy away everything after they've used them. I actually really admire that.
Right.
I thought it was sort of environment that like a good parent would have for their kids at home,
Yeah.
And then, but so that I really liked in terms of the methodology. Then there's the teaching, which is different. And there is structure. It's not completely, like laissez-faire to the degree that people just do what they want. But it's very individualized, adaptive to the individual kids. They get to know the kids really well, and also the small group thing, not the whole class. They hardly do any. I don't think they do any whole class teaching. And then there's no testing, no exams. It's all through observation, which I think is right. Once you get to know your learners, you know what their competencies are and where they are on that road of learning or acquiring skills or whatever. So it's much more organized than you might think from the teacher's point of view. Okay. But writing, I go back to this point time and time again, writing is really lies at they teach children to write before they read. It's really interesting. Before, they don't do what normal primary school try and shove books down kids' throats. You must read this. You must read to your child before they go to sleep every night, sort of thing. They're very, very big on teaching writing. And before many state schools adopted this, encouraged the phonetic approach, which tried phonics. So she proved to be right on that, as opposed to the whole word method that became disastrously popular in our schooling system and still very common in the US. So it's a home from home. I think that's how it seemed to me when I walked into the school and had a look at the methods. Then they get the parents involved. I think that's a nice thing as well. That was also true of Rudolph Steiner things. They don't see the parents as the enemies. In other words, I take your child, I lock the gate, I deliver them back at 4:30, and don't dare come in and speak to me because I'm responsible for their education, not you. I think there is quite a nice thing in Montessori, and that is still the retention of domestic skills, learning to cook, and be at ease with other people and so on. So very much like Rousseau, Dewey, and others, practical vocational skills they're keen on as well, as am I. I think the schooling system has got bizarrely academic, focusing wholly and utterly on reading and writing in one form or another, whatever subject it is. I am actually glad I went to a school where I did metalwork, woodwork, technical drawing. I made stuff. They're still one of some of my most vivid memories of school and learning, and found them valuable all my life. But I think we've stripped all that out of the schooling system, and thankfully Montessori didn't.
One thing that leaps out to me, actually, is the fact that she started in remedial learning, and that she was working with people with learning difficulties, intellectually challenged, whatever the right phraseology is for that. And then it seems to move on to a general theory of education. We kind of blurred over that in the introduction, but do you know more about how that happens, how it makes the transition for being, this is how you do a special school for people who, have challenges, to this is the favoured education method of the middle classes, wooden toys and all that?
It's a good point, that, John, because I think many people send their kids to Steiner, especially Montessori schools, because their kids, they either anticipate or find that their kids struggle in mainstream schooling because of the whatever bullying or the pressured environment, the overemphasis on testing, the lack of arts or whatever. But I think for Montessori, go back to her for a moment, she was very intellectual about this. So that notion that you had to, the reason she was very keen on personal agency and understanding the emotional and well-being side of a child was that actually it's true. If you don't understand that, you will completely misread some of the behavioral issues or failure to learn issues amongst children. And we've found this in modern schools because kids with obviously the obvious signs of sometimes invisible signs like dyslexia, autism, ADHD are being dealt with on a far better level than they were when I was at school. People with dyslexia basically failed and they popped out the other end. Didn't go to university, but very often very smart people who ended up. I remember my experience in City Guilds going into these people who were learning hairdressing. They were all amazing business people. They started and ran sometimes hugely successful businesses, and many of them were dyslexic, and they had been denied the opportunity of going to university because universities aren't interested in people who don't write essays. They just are not. But nowadays, I think we've come to recognize Montessori's notion that things like movement and things that are important in learning, that the autonomy of the learner is important, but more importantly, their emotional makeup. And I learned that when I was a governor in a secondary school, that, problem children, even that adjective is problematic. Yeah. Once you know the backstory, it's horrific sometimes. Your heart bleeds really. But people make judgments on kids very, very quickly without understanding what lies behind the behavior or their failure to learn. And I think she tries to give those kids meaningful context in which they can learn. Yeah,
I remember there being something called junior remove. There was always the remove. The kids with disabilities or problems were hived off to this separate place. I mean, interestingly, Billy Bunter, when we were talking earlier about Arnold Russell, he is often called the fat owl of the remove.
Yeah.
I mean, this is certainly not language we'd use anymore at the moment. So I wonder with Montessori, to get back to that question of transition from remedial education to kind of having a system for everybody, is it in a way it's similar to that syndrome you get with accessibility nowadays, that if you design systems and environments with people with disabilities and challenges in mind, it actually gets easier and more efficient for everybody else as well.
Yeah,
we found this again, like with the design of supermarkets. If you look at the problems of disabled people in a supermarket checkout, suddenly it becomes easier for an undisabled, if you like, mother with children to negotiate that environment, because and similarly with Montessori, she made discoveries in that process that help towards a general bettering of how you educate people, because everybody's different.
That's right. And I think this mass schooling or state schooling on the whole has this regression to the mean problem. And so they deliver sort of one size fits all type things. And to be honest, I think the big distortion there is that one size fits all isn't for all at all. It's actually for those kids who are heading towards uni or going to uni, as middle class parents call it. That's what the whole system is geared towards. And I think that I've seen that happen in my lifetime, because I only had 4 people from my secondary school went to university. It wasn't such a big deal that people didn't, hardly anybody aspired to do so, in fact. But we now have a system that's wholly and utterly geared towards that. I think this is a huge mistake, that it's gone too far. I would personally strip billions out of the higher education system and reshape the educational system around something that's fairer and more productive for society as a whole. So that's one observation. The second observation is, to be fair, the state system is doing quite well here. You have special educational needs facilities in most schools now, and those people are very, very good and skilled and professional in dealing with kids who struggle to fit in and so on. Nevertheless, the idea, the trouble is parents are, the trouble with research on, if you say, well, just Montessori or the Steiner schools, what research is that model is superior, let's say, to the state system. The problem is that you can't get the data because the people who go there have been selected by their parents, and that's a very self-selecting process.
Yeah, so by postcode and class and
exactly, John.
Like that, yeah.
And I think you nailed that at the beginning, talking about Steiner. It's a certain type of parent that's more likely to send their kids to either Steiner or Montessori. There's probably a difference between those two groups, in fact.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, I think there was a big difference in Montessori compared to Steiner, and that she massively influenced Piaget and others as well. But I think the success of the Montessori schooling system shows that there is something in this. Look after the emotional side of children, deal with them as individuals, and give them personal agency, which is why you have people like Sergey Brin and so on saying, well, yeah, this made me as an adult, I think there's something in that. And I think there's something in it because I think we may be moving into an era now where technology allows people to be more individualized, where the technology is delivering the personal feedback and allowing people to develop at the rate that's right for them. You know, this notion that there's a certain time to competence. Why? The problem is this obsession with time, you know, the 1 hour period, the 1 hour lecture. We started with the Sumerians, but as I often say, the 1 hour is only because the Sumerians had a base 6 number system. All these kids march off from one classroom to another. Nobody in the real world does that. Imagine a company where every hour, everybody in the whole company stood up and marched off to do something else, you know? Why don't the teachers move? It's just one person, you know? So we got stuck in this Prussian model, which I think is oppressive. I think schools are a breeding ground because teachers don't fully understand. I have a personal view on this, which is teachers don't fully understand peer group pressure, which is everything in a school, and that kids suffer badly from that. You know, there are many children I feel who find it just all too much. And one of the saddest things in my life was walking across Beachy Head, and there was a little metal cross, and you know, had been placed there by parents, and their 16-year-old girl had thrown herself off the cliff because of her exam results. And it was devastating. You know, imagine that, you know, a young girl, brave enough in a way, but damaged by the system so much she could throw herself off a cliff. Unbelievable. And I think there are many young people suffering in relative silence because they don't go to their teachers or their parents, but they're crippled inside because they feel they're failures. It's driving people through, you know, the hideous spectacle of these kids who've got their 12 GCSEs and are going to Cambridge or something, and that we get every year, while the rest are almost mocked as being failures. I find it distasteful, the whole thing. And anyway, I better stop there because I'll get too political as usual.
Well, you put me in a terrible position here, Donald, because now I'm going to look completely Prussian by saying we have to move along, and also you know,
yeah,
we'll take a pause to reflect on the emotions that you will have triggered in people who had bad schooling there. But nevertheless, onwards we must go. Alexander Sutherland Neill. Born in Forfar, Scotland, to a couple of school teachers, Alexander Sutherland Neill was a transformative figure in the realm of progressive education. His upbringing in a stern Calvinist environment, his dad was a spare the rod, spoil the child type of schoolmaster by the sound of it, probably played a significant role in shaping his critique of traditional educational paradigms. Neill further developed his perspectives during his academic journey at the University of Edinburgh, immersing himself in educational psychology. A couple of resonances with your own background there, Donald.
It is, yeah.
In 1921, Neill established Summerhill School in Leiston, is it? Leiston in
That's
Suffolk.
Right, Leiston.
Which would soon become a beacon of progressive education. The school's radical tenets, such as optional lessons and a democratic decision-making process involving both students and staff, they got an equal vote in that, stemmed from Neill's belief in the intrinsic goodness of children. I'm going to say that again and pause. The intrinsic goodness of children. Mm-hmm. Parents will now be doing a chin rub over that one. He was convinced that when free from compulsion, children would naturally lean into learning. Neill's ideas were influenced by the radical psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich, as we pointed out in the Ukraine episodes I did. Both shared convictions about the importance of emotional well-being and personal freedom, principles that were embedded in the fabric of Summerhill's philosophy. Although personally, I have to say I would trust my children with Neill a long time before I trust Wilhelm Reich with the child of mine. However, Summerhill was not without its controversies. Critics argued that the school's liberal approach could be detrimental to academic achievement and discipline. Moreover, the school faced numerous challenges from educational authorities, questioning its unorthodox methodologies. Ofsted tried to shut the school down around the turn of the millennium, and I think it was it David Blunkett behind that? Didn't get away with it. Despite the debates surrounding Summerhill, Neill's influence remains undeniable. His magnum opus, Summerhill, A Radical Approach to Child Rearing, delves deeply into his innovative educational stance, continuing to inspire educators and thinkers worldwide. Donald, the core of Neill's approach seems to have been instilling a kind of, if I can caricature it, don't worry, be happy vibe among the kids. He really wanted them to be happy, which is an incredibly novel proposition in education. It turns out. And we couldn't be further here from Hegel's view of education, covered in the last episode, where I caricatured him as the demon headmaster. How do you assess Neill's take on learning?
Yeah, listening to you, he is the sort of person I have most sympathy and empathy with. I feel you because I know where he's coming from, this sort of Scottish Calvinism. He comes from a place in Forfar, which you will not know this probably, but most Scottish people do. It's famous for the Forfar Bridie, which is the Scottish equivalent of the Cornish pasty. It's a great big giant half moon thing filled with mince and onions. But I curiously when you're going to latitude, I popped into Leiston. It's on the road. It's in Suffolk. It's actually right next to where you can actually almost see the sizable nuclear reactor on the coast from the building itself. It's a beautiful sort of Victorian brick building with ivy clad on one end of it and so on, and nice mosaic. It's got that, oh yeah, this is a bit hippie-ish vibe to it when you go there. But of course, he was Scottish. I think that influenced him because, curiously, you might think that he had a great deal of deep learning theory in him as a person, but when you read the book, actually a number of different sort of essays cobbled together, really, you don't find much learning theory, really. In fact, people always thought he was a sort of big fan of Rousseau until he admitted that he had never read Rousseau. It was well after he opened the school. He wasn't really that type of intellectual as a person. But what he was, in addition to the Calvinist background, he had been brought up in that whole Freudian context where the assumption was that it's a Rousseauian view idea, but really he's more of a Freudian fan than Rousseau. He thinks that children are literally uses the word repressed. He thinks that repression comes when you apply all these constraints that normal schooling imposes upon young people, and that repression results in resentment. So that's the sort of premise behind everything else here. He thinks the kids just become incredibly discontented and unhappy, behave oddly and so on when you start to repress them. Okay. And what are the forms of repression, of course, are, as we just described, the Prussian system of a fixed timetable, fixed curriculum. You stand up every hour, you hear bells ringing, you get punished if you do wrong, and a whole load of moral and religious stuff that's thrown in to keep you on the right sort of path of righteousness. He thinks this is nonsense. That's what he experienced in Scotland and didn't under that Calvinist notion of mass schooling, and he did not like it. And I have some sympathy with him on that front. So the modern concepts of well-being, he used that word, in fact, are like both he and Montessori believed strongly in that you let the child develop as opposed to impose adult rules upon the child. And again and again and again, you hear, just like Montessori, emotion. The emotional needs of the child are important. We cannot rely on a purely rational educational system that focuses that's all head, no heart. Actually, every teacher who's ever tried to teach a bunch of kids knows that this is true. But the state system, or certainly the public private school system, they find that difficult. You've got 30 kids in a room, they've got an exam to pass. You tend to start behaving rather oddly, as do they. But he did have this Rousseauian idea of innate goodness, that notion of, although he didn't base this on any deep theory in any sense. He just felt that was instinctively true. And he hated punishment in schools, as I do as well. I remember well in my Calvinist upbringing, and I was a very bookish kid, very subservient in a way. Even I was thrashed to an inch of my life with a leather strap from some little psychopaths who were teachers in the schools I went to. So I think he reacted badly against that sort of stuff. But I think on punishment, really interesting, I like about Neill, and that's why Wollstonecraft's book on education I really loved. And it's another woman like Montessori who wrote in a deep sense about education. He instituted Wollstonecraft's idea of peer punishment. In other words, if somebody was, doing things that were really unacceptable to the group determined the punishment. which is never physical. Never hit anybody or caned or strapped them or anything. But there would be there were. It was really a democracy. So they have these weekly meetings in the school. It's really interesting when you go to the school. It's really that shines through this notion that it's a democratic environment, and that he only had one vote, teachers have one vote, and so on. But the democratic decisions are made by the children themselves, and that they have a voice. That was quite important. We used to call it student voice. A headmaster I worked with was quite big on this. And I learned how important that was. I was a bit skeptical at the beginning. Well, they're just kids. Why should we give them a voice? But until I sat down with 8 kids from the school I was in, and they said, well, you do realize that the substitute teachers come in and just show us Toy Story. And, we don't do any learning at all. I'm like, really? Every one of them nodded. Yeah, that happens all the time. And in fact, the reason they brought it up is they were annoyed that they never saw the end of the movie because it was less than the period length.
Oh, yeah.
And then they say, well, we can't get, in summer it's really roasting. There's no water in the playground. I think that's weird because there was a little well in the school I went to back in the day. So we put one of those little spout things into the playground. It was an incredibly valuable experience speaking to the kids about what was wrong. Of course, the great fuss amongst the teachers, of course, because when you make an accusation like, do you know substitute teachers come in and slam a DVD on and let the kids watch Toy Story? They deny it at first, but of course the kids know it happens, and so on and so forth. So there's something in student voice. And I think the nice thing about Somerville is it had this massive sort of, it actually didn't, it came out of Germany originally. Everything comes out of Germany here, doesn't it? But I think the trouble is they're unsustainable financially, and also find it difficult to fit, as you say. Ofsted tried to close them down. They're a round peg in a square hole in terms of the state system, so tend to suffer from the state regulation around education, quality control, Ofsted, and so on. I think that's a real shame. But they've survived, and the numbers have dropped, but you still have, I don't know how many it'll be, it's about 10 teachers or so, that's that size, a couple hundred kids and so on. But you still have loyalists who send their kids there. The book was interesting because Summerhill, when I was younger, that book was very, very famous. It was in all the bookshops because hardly anybody sent their kids to Summerhill or a Summerhill type school. But most progressive parents felt that they quite liked Summerhill or had bought the book or had some sympathies towards the book. But in truth, it never really took off. Progressive schooling hasn't taken off. And that, although, interestingly, I think post-COVID, maybe we'll leave this to end, but I think the rise of homeschooling, the massive number of kids who have not gone back to school, there's some interesting, but let's leave that towards the end, I think, John.
Yeah. It's interesting that a while ago there was a free schools movement that came from the Tory government. My perhaps rather prejudiced partisan view on that was just an excuse to try and get the public sector in there and get people to make more money out of education that they can hive off to tax resorts in the Bermudas or whatever. But interestingly, there was a Rudolph Steiner school that managed to get state funded during as a result of that, and there are all sorts of other experiments as well. Is this a thing in education where you get occasionally from time to time get a recrudescence of an interest in, well, maybe there's another model that might work better?
Well, the interesting thing about free schools, it was actually really started by Tony Blair, and so it's often thought to be a sort of Tory thing. But what happened is Tony
Blair is a Tory.
Yes, yeah. Well, what's interesting, I think that government did a lot of good things at one of the but I think he was terrible in education because his personal it was all about him allowing religious schools to flourish, because as we know, he then converted to Catholicism and so on, deep religious convictions. But what happened was he created the free school movement, really, and boy, did the Tories run with it. What they did was create MATs, so you could have these big corporate type entities running many, many schools. There's some rationale in that, actually, because it may save you money and procurement and so on. In actual fact, what it led to was these sort of very, very wealthy CEOs sitting above the MATs. But that's a huge political thing, but it's very complicated. But still, despite all that superstructure, people fiddle around with the structures of schooling all the time. Actually, what happens in a classroom day by day tends to remain much the same. So that's just sort of superstructure, differences, really. And that was an attempt to get rid of the control of local authorities by the Conservative government, really, in creating maps. But that's complicated in itself. Coming back to the direction of travel here, you're thinking, I'm quite pleased that these oddball schools, we call them that. Again, I'm guilty of using the wrong adjectives here. But these schools like Steiner schools and Montessori schools are still around. I think it's more insidious that you have the rise of religious schooling. And so we have many purely Islamic, purely Jewish, purely Church of England schools. I'm not too sure this is healthy. Witness what's happening on our television screens right now in the Middle East, and even the reaction to that in our own individual countries. So,
probably for another podcast.
Sorry, John?
Probably for another podcast.
It is indeed, yes.
Other than us. Yes. Just before we go, some notable former pupils from Summerhill include Rebecca de Mornay, very good actress in Hollywood. Gus Dudgeon, who produced a lot of Elton John's records. Again, you see, it's the creative industries that come out of this type of education a lot of the time. And John Birmingham, who isn't a massive name, child's author and illustrator, but he created my favourite ever book to read to children, Mr. Gumpy's Outing. Just lurching towards the autobiographical. So let's move on. Vicky Colbert, 1948 to 9. I think that means we're not sure, maybe she isn't sure whether she was born in 1948 or 9. Sure, there's a story there. Don't know it. And still among us. Vicky Colbert is a renowned Colombian educator and social entrepreneur, best recognized for her pioneering efforts in reshaping rural education in Latin America. Born in the late 1940s, Colbert's passion for education was evident from the start. Her dedication led her to pursue her studies in sociology and anthropology at Stanford University. Now, she was born in Colombia, but went to Stanford University and American universities in general, enhancing her understanding of societal structures and their impact on education. In collaboration with Oscar Mogolon, I think I'm pronouncing that right, and probably wrong, and Roberto Bernal, Colbert co-developed the innovative Escuela Nueva, New School model in the 1970s. This groundbreaking model shifted the traditional teacher-centered paradigm to a student-centered one, emphasizing cooperative learning, flexibility, and active participation. Some things in common for a lot of these models, particularly tailored for multi-grade schools in rural areas. Escuela Nueva transformed the way rural education was perceived and implemented. Colbert's remarkable vision earned her numerous accolades, including the prestigious Yidan Prize and the Scholl Award for Social Entrepreneurship. Throughout her career, she held pivotal positions, such as serving as Colombia's Vice Minister of Education, that enabled her to advocate and spread her approach. More than just an educator, Vicky Colbert stands as a beacon for innovative educational change. I'm afraid these intros are getting a bit flowery, and I blame ChatGPT for that. It seems to be much more flowery than me. Her relentless commitment to bettering the educational landscape. You see an example there? I would have struck a few of those adjectives out. To bettering the educational landscape, especially for marginalized communities, continues to inspire educators and policymakers across the globe. Donald, we covered Freire's work in South America last time when we were talking about Marxists. Is there a resonance here with Colbert's work, or is that just because it's South America and I'm too broad brushing my thinking?
Yeah, Freire, yeah. Well, the Escuela Nueva is a model for schools, as it were, and quite separately from that, you have Paul Freire's theories. They have their sort of unique characteristics, but they do share common ideals about education. You're right in that observation. That's definitely true. And of course, they're in the same part of the world as Freire worked extensively in South America, so everybody knows his theories, his critical pedagogy type approach to life. But I think the commonality, it's not as if this is a manifestation of Freire, these schools. It's very much Vicky Colbert's ideas themselves. But student engagement is a big thing, active participation, the shift away from that mass schooling, teacher top-down banking of knowledge stuff. Vicky Colbert definitely believes in that. And more importantly, just like Freire, it's contextualized. She's living in countries where most of the population live in the countryside in small subsistence farming. So this urban model of schooling that comes out of central, out of Prussia and Europe and America seems singularly inappropriate. I actually met Vicky Colbert, in Doha in Qatar, of all places, a massive conference. And she was very passionate about this. She was sort of slightly angry about, the North imposing its inappropriate will on the Southern Hemisphere. And the older I've got, the more I've been in Africa twice this year. I think there's some truth in this, to be honest. We have screwed things up not only for ourselves at times, but them as well. And so what she did try and do, and I think succeeded, she's a really sort of enthusiastic person. And when you hear her talk about the movement, as it were, Escuela Nueva model, you can see why it took off. You always have to have this leader, I think, that pushes these things, and it was recognized. She won loads of awards. The World Bank were keen on funding it and so on. But at its heart is the student parent approach. Be very sensitive to the needs of the people in that community, because most of them, this is where at the same conference, interestingly, I met Gordon Brown, who gave a good but terrible speech saying that the sustainable goals, it was all about abstract reason for him, saying as long as we get everybody into schools, and as long as you get all girls into schools, everything will be hunky-dory. This idea that you just get people into classrooms, you teach them to read and write, and that's it. And of course, that's far from it, because most of them even don't have jobs. And therefore, so you suddenly find yourself in Zimbabwe or South Africa, where all the taxi drivers have degrees. And you wonder what went wrong here. And yet, in some of those countries, including our own, things don't work. The world seems to be falling apart practically because we have no vocational skills. We have massive skill shortages, but no shortage on people who can critique Macbeth. So I think her view was, in her world, you had to have this, cost was a big deal. Most of these schools were crippled because the government didn't have enough money to have a state schooling system. So the view was make them really cost effective. Scalable was a really important thing. She had this model that, remember, this is a model we're talking about here, that was manifested in real schools, that fitted into the real community. There was always a context here. The reality of everybody's life was they worked in farms and had to sell things to survive. So that's what she focused on. The teachers, there's far less direct instruction in our schools, far less rote learning, all that sort of stuff. There were all these little micro centres she created, very keen on workshops, sharing community practice across the schools, especially the teachers. There were networks of teachers that picked up on the model and took the best bits from other schools and applied them in their own. And then at the same time, it was a bit like Montessori, highly structured, because you have all these independent self-paced interactive modules that people do that we're familiar with, with when technology delivers learning. So, but this is the importance of this was I remember when she explained this, it was amazing. In a rural environment, people just disappeared. When the harvest comes along, people just walk out of school because you can't afford to let that fail. The same with true of planting of seeds and so on. So you have to actually build schooling around the needs of the community, or they just won't turn up. Mm-hmm. So in that case, you have to deal with all the absences. And if you have this self-paced, interactive, modular approach, you have a flexible approach to the delivery or the teaching, then it copes with any local circumstance in terms of timetable. So that obviously everywhere has a local, it was localized, the agricultural calendar. Some people might do fruit picking, which is a completely different time from other types of harvest, for example, potato picking or whatever. And her profound belief really struck me, that education is for life and making a living. It can be both. It's not just this, you hear this from abstract intellectuals all the time saying, well, let's keep education as a purely abstract thing, education as an end in itself. You hear this from academics a lot. Well, we're destroying the educational system, the higher education system, because it's been taken over by managerialism. And then you look around and you've got a dentistry department, you've got an engineering department, you've got a medical department, a nursing department. You go, what, are you honestly telling me that these dental students are there because they're intellectually interested in the journey around teeth? Give me a break. They're there to make money as being dentists. And so I think the system itself is schizophrenic because it accepts oodles of money from people who go there. Do you think people take law because they're just massively interested in the philosophy of jurisprudence, or do they want to become lawyers and make a lot of money? I suspect the latter is normally the case. But the recognition in her world was that it was an agricultural economy and we have to play to that. And she wasn't saying that's true for everybody, but it was certainly true because the model then was spread right through Central and Southern America. You know, you had El Salvador, Honduras, the Philippines, similar thing, Panama and Paraguay and so on. So I think she had a point about context and not regarding, like Gordon Brown did, education is, and the World Bank sustainability goals are all very Northern Hemisphere abstract and rational. And so you find that education teaches people, but doesn't solve the problem of them not living autonomous lives as adults because they can't get jobs.
It's interesting that you bring up the agricultural thing and because I've heard you rail before about the fact that we had this massively long summer holiday in Northern Hemisphere schools, which was originally designed so that kids could go and help with the harvest. And, you know, in a similar way when we were an agrarian country, which we're now very much not so. I mean, the people who pick who get in the harvest are now, well, for a long time have been Eastern European. So does that seem to say that in countries where there is still that need, it makes sense to do that? Whereas you know, we could easily jump that, really, as long as we can afford air conditioning for the schools. And it's the problem is a one-size-fits-all model just doesn't work.
Well, that's right. It's interesting. When I was at school, we had in fact, this week, isn't it? The October week was the week where lots of people went picking potatoes. It was really common for parents as well. You know, they would have a job picking potatoes because they made a lot of money in a week. So it was still around when I was younger because we still had a partly agrarian economy. It's now all been mechanized, of course. But you're right here, and this is Vicky Colbert's point, wasn't that we should adhere to the agricultural calendar. In fact, we've done the very opposite. We've adhered to the agricultural calendar when there is no agricultural need.
Yeah,
She had the very opposite view, is that you look at the context of the community in which your kids work. Now, of course, this is where you get class coming in, of course, because many middle class people don't see their kids as being rooted in a local community at all. The people who talk most about community have least interest in it. They send their kids off to some like we both live in Brighton, John, but how often do the kids here go off to Manchester, Leeds, Bristol or Exeter or something to university? Glasgow, Edinburgh. The whole point is to get them out of the community, free them up. There's somewheres and anywhere type classes of people, whereas working class people are much more deeply rooted in the community. I mean, both my families, myself and my wife's family, but almost everybody else still lives in and around the towns they were brought up in. It's a completely different view of the world. But when we base an educational system around funneling everybody towards university, we sort of abandon and ignore the rest. And that's what's happened, I think, in our country and other countries. But at least Vicky Colbert recognized that would be ridiculous in South America. And what's really interesting when you travel into what you might call 2.5 or developing world, you find these hyper expensive private schools in places like Zimbabwe that are full of white kids, of course, same in South Africa. And Australia is very similar. I was absolutely shocked when I went to Melbourne. I got to speak in a couple of schools there. And they have taken this so seriously. People are desperate to get their kids into private schools there. And they have all the trappings of the British system, girls wearing tartan skirts, guys blazered and tied up to the neck in 35 degrees heat. So we have schooling is just one of the things emerging as we speak about this, John. Schooling is just very odd, isn't it?
It is when you think about it. Yes, the more you think about it, the odder it seems. Yeah. We better move along and have some more things to think about.
Yeah.
Martin Burt, 1957, which makes him a rough contemporary of ours, Donald. Born in 1957, still among us. He's a Paraguayan social entrepreneur, author, former mayor of Asunción, and former chief of staff to Paraguay's president, known for founding, going to struggle again here, Fundación Paraguaya in 1985, a leading non-profit and microfinance organization in Paraguay. And he's creator of the Poverty Stoplight, a tool that enables families to assess their own level of poverty across multiple dimensions and develop personalized strategies to overcome them, which sounds really interesting. I think I could do that at the moment. This methodology has since been adopted and replicated in various countries, emphasizing Burt's influence on a global scale. I think it's interesting. We're talking on a much bigger scale with these last two theorists. Think of Summerhill. It's
Yes,
it's an almost negligible amount of people who went through that,
yeah.
Compared to its massive influence. Burt studied at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California, at George Washington University, which I think is in Washington, and Tulane University in New Orleans, where he did a PhD in development economics and international development. And I think it's an interesting context in which to talk about education and education theory. Throughout his career, Burt has collaborated with a range of international organizations and has received numerous accolades for his work, including being recognized by Ashoka and the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship. His commitment to reshaping education and creating a world without poverty reflects his visionary approach and the tangible impact of his initiatives. So, Donald, can you do a compare contrast with Vicky Colbert on him, and continue your compare and contrast with the northern and southern hemisphere?
Yeah, very much a southern hemisphere figure. Very different from. I also met Martin Burt in Doha another occasion. Was hugely impressed by this guy. First of all, he was a sort of really interested in the poverty issues. You're right, this poverty spotlight thing was a later development by him, nevertheless important. But his diagnosis of schooling systems was that they actually had the very opposite effect of what most people imagined was true, that they're not really meritocracies, and that they trap people in sort of class structures. That's what we talked about in the Marxist episodes. So he thought schooling really trapped people into poverty, and that there were really sort of sorting mechanisms for people who could give kids a leg up by getting them into university and giving them that big signal in their forehead and getting them into the professions. And that, of course, wasn't true in Paraguay, where he was a senior politician, the mayor of Asuncion, one off the president, as it were. He was also a successful business guy. And he was very keen of trying to solve this problem of schooling as a business. This, people in England would hate that phrase, but actually it has a great deal, people in South America are not fazed by this at all. He thought that schools were massively over-academic, and that it's not to say that academic subjects should not be taught, but they should be taught alongside vocational skills. Basically, the sort of things in his schools were things like business, how to grow things, make cheese, ferment yogurt, and all that sort of stuff. It's what people did in their real lives. This is how they made a living and how they actually grew food for themselves. They were very often self-sustained communities, grew their own food. But he then was quite keen in teaching them how to be quite autonomous people in terms of their personal finance, marketing, whatever skills they've got, selling, customer service, all that sort of stuff. And so he was very keen on schools being, and this is where it got really interesting, in schools being little sort of mini businesses. He was very successful in this, actually. He was saying, well, let's make the school, the school can be self-sustaining and sell food. The little shop store, and that shop would be where people would learn retail skills, for example. So he had these farm schools that he set up all over the shop. They were pretty successful. It was really very, very impressive indeed, because he was tackling the reality of poverty, not the notion that, you want to go get a degree for some abstract intellectual journey you may see yourself on. But of course, people don't like this view in the Northern Hemisphere, but it's quite common in the Southern Hemisphere to see this as being an important part of life, where you have to teach people to be autonomous in the context of their world. These kids are not going to go into an internship in Deloitte. It's not going to happen. So what is their life? Well, they live in the countryside, they live in the farming community, they have to sell their goods. Let's focus on their needs. And I greatly admire this, because I've seen a lot of imposition of Northern Hemisphere educational values, goals, structures, universities and colleges in the Southern Hemisphere, and it has not worked. So if you take Africa as an example, the one I know best. Everywhere you go in Africa, go to Ethiopia, the Chinese have built everything. because they have no plumbers and builders and skilled people in Ethiopia, because they have no educational system that promotes vocational skills. But they do have lots of universities that produce graduates who then end up largely as taxi drivers. I mean, it's a caricaturist to a degree, but there's a lot of truth in this. And so I think something has gone badly wrong here, which is why I like to include, Vicky Colbert and Martin Burt in this group.
Yeah.
Because I think they show an alternative vision that's not based on our northern prejudices.
I think it's a really interesting comparison you're making here with northern and southern hemispheres, and the way education is shaped there, and the way these initiatives have played there, as opposed to the northern hemisphere, where some of the previous ones seemed like experiments that don't really get kind of assessed very well. And it's hard to see that they have a very widespread effect. On the other hand, having said that, it would be, rather dangerous to fall into a strict binary there. And
yeah, true.
There has been development in the education system since, we were youths, and some of that has done a lot of good. So probably time now to move towards summing up. Donald, you showed us these variety of experiments or alternatives, I suppose we could call them. I just want to go back to the root of this and what is being held on to, it seems, in your kind of summary of what's wrong with the Northern Hemisphere education, is Arnold's vision, really, of culture and of kind of educating people to take part in this kind of bourgeois culture and so on. And then you start to get people who kind of vary from that. And I mentioned that the mysticism was also to do with Dover Beach. Dover Beach shows godless universe. People lose faith in, the established church in Britain kind of gets its hands pulled off from around the throat of society. I know we still have bishops in the Lords and so on, but generally religion isn't so much of a touchstone as it was for morality after Darwin and Dover Beach. And one of the effects of this is for people to lurch off into the occult, which is where we get that kind of interest in theosophy and Aleister Crowley and so on, which is still bumping around in the alternative counterculture of the 60s, 70s and 80s. And, I come across a lot of that, I must admit, in my life. Another kind of effect of the Dover Beach syndrome, if we're going to call it that, I think, is that people want to find a moral basis for their educational systems. And we see a variety of these here, with kind of, not so much with Montessori, which I suppose is more practical, but certainly with Summerhill. It, as you say, goes back to Rousseauan values, something which isn't a Christian morality. And in the Southern Hemisphere examples you've given, there's a very strong moral impetus there towards eliminating poverty and working on the roots of poverty within communities, and using education to do that and changing it to make it more fit for purpose for that. So if we look at that in the round, how much are the people that you've brought together in this group, although it's a very disparate group, how much has that actually changed education?
Yeah, what can we learn from them? You mentioned Dover Beach there. I know we had communication on this, but this was just last Sunday when I took my dog for a walk with my wife Jill, and we were walking back in a little village near Brighton called Seaford.
Oh yeah,
and there was a plaque on the wall to Herman Ebbinghaus. I was absolutely astonished, because we did a whole podcast on this, John.
In fact, it's where the podcast started. Our first episode was about cognitivists, and I think it started with Ebbinghaus.
That's right. You're absolutely right. That's the very first person we discussed. And it was interesting because I wrote a little bit about it, and curiously I put because I love that poem, Dover Beach. I think it's actually a masterpiece of poetry. It's melancholy, but it's melancholy bringing the long withdrawing roar. That sound of the people just dragging away at the world, and that we just drift through the world unaware of the fact that the true heartbeat is one of nihilism and so on. It's an amazing piece of work. But what can we learn from these four people? Well, I think there's something quite interesting here. One is that we're sort of trapped, I think, in a very one-size-fits-all state schooling system, and I include the private schooling system in this as well. And what happened was things trapped us even further with the PISA and that horrific, beware of big bureaucrats bringing in systems that start to impose a one-size-fits-all on the whole globe. That's what PISA did. I absolutely hate that initiative. Because when it says it looks at schooling globally, but it doesn't really. It is the Northern Hemisphere model. Get your kid to uni is the model sort of thing there. But I think something very interesting has happened, John, that I'd like to dwell upon, maybe to round up here, is that some of the promise of those things that we've mentioned and the people we've discussed are happening not through establishing an alternative progressive schooling system, a la Burt, Colbert, Neill, Montessori, Steiner, but and this is really happening big time in the US at the moment. There has been a steady decrease in college enrollments for the last 13 years in a row, and it's quite considerable. That has also been matched more recently by dramatic falls in faith in the educational system as being relevant, worth the cost, and so on. So we see a crisis in relevance in the US in the college system and the schooling that funnels everybody towards it. We see a crisis in assessment because of AI hitting it. We see in schools in the UK a crisis even in attendance. That's been accompanied by a rise of homeschooling because you now have technology like AI that can allow you to teach kids to your maths without you knowing any mathematics. And at the same time as society, we have pretty much full employment, but massive skill shortages. So I've been flying around all over the place in the last few months. And, the system is barely surviving, whether it's the chances you get your flight delayed or the air traffic controllers have gone ill and we don't have enough of them or something has gone wrong. The world is sort of falling apart because we have a lack of skilled people in the middle ground, but no shortage of graduates at the upper level who now, of course, are massively underemployed. So doing things that they don't really need a degree for. Now, that's not to say a degree is not useful as and in itself. But as I say, education should perhaps be for both a life, an end in itself, and a living. There's no harm in that. Universities, after all, produce dentists, lawyers, engineers, and doctors. So it's always been the case since Bologna in the Middle Ages. But I think now we're looking at perhaps, I personally think there will be a bit of a resetting. I think this AI stuff is it's so different, so powerful. Will have such an impact on productivity, especially in education and healthcare. It changes the whole nature of work and therefore what you learn, why you learn, and how you learn. I think this may be one of the deep drivers that affect a change, just as printing did in the late 15th, early 16th century, when we had the rise of mass schooling. Go back to what I said at the beginning. You have the rise of mass schooling and mass textbook, massive one-size-fits-all methodologies in schools that was reinforced further through the Industrial Revolution. I think it's a revolution on that scale. When you're studying history, most people like to go back to the Second World War or something, get fascinated by that. Actually, the most relevant period in history that we should be studying in terms of us is probably the 16th century, when printing comes of age, really, and spreads like wildfire around Europe first, then the rest of the world. And some societies like the Ottoman Empire ban it, so don't grow and develop. Others take it up with a gusto. And then, however, the invention of printing has this double-edged sword effect. We send our kids off at age 5, as I say, they pop out. Now they have to do a master's degree, whatever age they pop out of university now, having never worked practically anywhere on anything. Many of them, not all of them. I think that's weird. And all they do for those years is really read and write. Read, critique text, write essays, write this, read that. That's weird to me now. I think we may be looking at what can we learn from these people, that actually learning should be much more contextualized by the real world we live in and solving the skill shortages, not in an instrumental way, but also the ethical issues. So I think really education is now one of the drivers behind the stretching of inequalities. The more bureaucratic, structured, university-driven education we have, the more this elastic stretches, and the poor get poorer and the rich get richer. Remember, it was the business schools of the US, and I remember teaching in Wharton, and these people were deluded. The idea that the business schools, and I remember going to the conferences and seeing, the chief exec, Jack Walsh of GE, I saw him live speaking. They said, we're going to destroy jobs in the US and outsource it all to China. They actually said that. And they did. They did it.
It happened.
I know. And then, of course, the university say, it wasn't our fault. I say, hold on a minute. Those business schools where you make all your money are not your fault. You say, you're being a bit sort of cherry picking here. Yeah. They actually did it. And then you wonder why they've got Trump. And then the graduate class looks down at all the people who voted for Trump, blaming them and themselves. And the same happened, I think, in the UK with Brexit and so on. I think we have, I'm a big fan of John Gray on this stuff. I think education has started to exacerbate inequalities, and there's a reaction against that, quite rightly. And I put myself very much in the camp that wants to change it, because I think it's gone too far, and that it's leading to social strife and social inequalities that societies are finding it hard to bear. I mean, we have extreme poverty in this country, and you need only walk from where we're sitting now, for 15, 20 minutes to hit people who are homeless in our town. Mm-hmm. And it's common. I mean, really common. Begging is just the norm now. That's
and shoplifting as well. It's on the rise. Yeah. And young people have a completely different outlook on it. They kind of think it's fair enough, because no young people have got any money anymore. Donald, I think you've really set us up well for the rest of the season here, because the next thing we're going to cover is critics of schools. Yeah. Formidable critic yourself. You're going to introduce us to some other critics of schools. It won't be completely negative, folks. Don't worry. And then after that, we're coming on to the other thing you mentioned there, which is AI and generative AI, which we'll be covering at the OEB conference live. And look forward to meeting some of you face to face. But for now, I think we need to bring it to a close. Thank you very much, Donald.
Thank you, John.
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and we thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. If you'd like text summaries and transcripts for these podcasts, as well as ads-free listening, early access to episodes and more, why not join the Learning Hack Pack? For less than the price of a coffee, you can get all these benefits and help to sustain us into the future. Go to patreon.com/learninghack for a 7-day free trial. That's patreon.com/learninghack.